Hi everyone, my name is Deanna and I'm going to share with you a little bit about my story and mostly focus on nutrition for those who are interested in healing or the best way of recovery from traumatic brain injury. A little bit about me. I spent close to 30 years in the Air Force as a physicist. I worked in lasers, a laser radar in particular. I specialize in electro-optics, next. And launched satellites, next. And worked in NATO operations, next. Missile defense, next. And finally, at my last assignment, I thought life was really great. I was a joint program office, I was a commander for the Joint Program Office for Biological Defense, and it was actually at the day of when I assumed command that I realized that something was really wrong, because every time I tried to take a breath, there would be excruciating pain that would radiate from my pelvis all the way up to my right shoulder. And at that point, they took me to the hospital. I was put immediately on a morphine IV because my body was convulsing involuntarily, and I found out I had ovarian cancer. Now, when they put me on that morphine IV, I realized that it did nothing to remove any of the pain. In fact, it made me sick. I became nauseous, so they gave me anti-nausea medications, and then that created constipation, so they gave me stool softeners, which created diarrhea, and then they said, oh, you have C. diff, which is a bacterial infection, and I thought to myself, well, I don't think I came in to the hospital with all these other issues, and so I said, you know what, I'm going to just get me off of all these medications. In fact, take this IV out of my arm. I had to sign a waiver for that, and they took it out, and I learned how to meditate. I heard something from Deepak Chopra where he said, wherever you're feeling pain in a body, just breathe into that space and send it love and compassion. And it took me 6 hours of doing this before that really excruciating pain went away. And from that experience, I decided that I wanted to try to heal holistically. So I changed my diet to an organic, raw, vegan one with a lot of green juices and wheatgrass juice. And my elevated cancer marker actually dropped back to normal, and the tumor that was in my left ovary began to shrink. And so I thought, oh great, everything's under control. I went back to working my normal 16 to 18-hour days in the Air Force, and next slide. Traveled overseas where I couldn't maintain a diet and regimen, and when I came back, you can see that I rapidly deteriorated. You know, you could still see I have muscle tone in my arm here, but in the image on the right, my arm, I just lose all my muscle mass. My abdomen becomes distended because the tumor begins to grow rapidly again, and it spreads. I'm told that it metastasized to my entire abdominal lining. Both of my lungs collapsed and filled with fluid. Next slide. And then, and I'm not pregnant there, that's actually the tumor. It was 27 centimeters, which is this big. And I begin to have a lot of edema where your body just retains a lot of fluid, and you can see how swollen my legs got. I was placed into hospice then and told I had 4 weeks left to live. And let me tell you, that's really a tough place to be when you're confronted with your own mortality. And a lot like what the previous speaker, Jim, was talking about, I learned to let go in order to have peace with my impending death. And I learned different things about letting go of my job, because even when I was in hospice, I was in some form of denial. I wanted to continue to work, but you know, I was far too sick to work, and so I had to let go of my job, because in my mind, that was my identity. You know, that's all I had known my whole life. And you know, when I'm laying in a hospice bed, unable to work, you know, I had to deal with, well, who am I really? And you know, do I have value inherently before God? And I concluded that I did, and God just did a series of miracles to show me how much He loved me, and that's what made it okay for me to go through this very painful process. And I learned to let go of my way of thinking, the paradigms that we are educated in, we're trained in. If you kind of keep too locked into that, you may not see the full set of solutions. And in my case, I had to let go of even some of what I believed in, with the nutritional healing, and I had to fight my way to get back into the medical system, because when my blood pressure tanked and all my muscles in my body were contracting, and it literally felt like my abdomen was going to explode, my cousin called 911 because the hospice nurse said, "Oh, just give her some more painkillers and call me back in a half hour." And I'm just so grateful my cousin called 911. They came, brought me to the hospital, and they were just going to tell me to wait again. I said, "I can't wait." They took fluid out of me, and at that point, they admitted me into the hospital. And the oncologist says, your condition is so poor, you've got to start chemo right away. That's your only hope to survive. And at that point, I prayed. And I told God, I said, if you want me to do chemo, I will do this. But I know with my background, and I've worked in chemical and biological warfare in the military, I know the effects that chemotherapy would have on my immune system, which is the very system you need to fight cancer. And so what I heard back was ask for the cytology report. Now back then, I didn't even know what a cytology report was, but I asked for it anyway. The oncologist, said, "No, we don't have time to wait for that. 100% it's going to be malignant, and if you don't start chemo right away, we're going to put you back in a hospice where you are going to die." But I pushed back, and finally he agreed, and 2 days later he came back to me and said, "Your intuition to wait for this report was a good one, because out of the fluid that they took out of me, it came back negative for cancer cells." And so that opened up the opportunity for me to have surgery. I had to wait for another 3 days, and in the meantime, my blood levels are critically low. I have 5 blood transfusions. They have to drain my lungs, they drain my abdomen, because there's fluid around my heart too. And the surgeon didn't think I was even strong enough to go through a major surgery, but they decided to go ahead with it. And by the time I got through with that, I had to go through months of rehabilitation. My muscles were all atrophied from being bedridden for so long, and I couldn't even lift up a dinner plate. They had to tie a strap around me to go up and down the stairs, and so it was a process. And I share this story with you because what I learned from this is that not only do you have to let go of just some of the ideas that we approach life with, but be open to how you might even support your body with nutrition. Because when I finally came through, I went back and saw some of my doctors, and they told me that it was my diet and regimen that made a critical difference. Because when it all started, I didn't mention I had not only that tumor in my left ovary, but there was also a spot on my lung. And I mentioned it spread to my abdomen, and I also had another tumor under my right arm, and some of these tumors actually disappeared on their own from the diet, and I know from God's grace. And so with that, I want to kind of shift into talking about traumatic brain injury. I've experienced some of that. I used to do gymnastics, and I would fall and hit my head. When I went to the Air Force Academy, we had to do pugil stick fighting, where they're kind of banging your head, with a bat, essentially. And I really believe that nutrition can make a key difference. What I was really amazed to see was that a lot of the nutritional approaches that I took for cancer, some of them are very similar for traumatic brain injury. So next slide. And so this is just an overview of some of the statistics. There's about 1.4 million people that come down with TBI every year, and it actually contributes to 30% of all deaths in the US. And every day, 138 people actually die from TBI. And so it can affect your thinking, memory, movement, how you see, how you hear, as well as your emotions. Next. And TBI can result from a bump on the head, but it can also be a penetrating injury. And it ranges from mild to severe. Next. And if you click on the thing, it'll show, yeah. Oh, I guess there's no sound though. But anyway, that's, kind of gives you an idea that there's not only linear forces that occur within the brain. So when you hit one part of the brain, it might actually create injury on the opposite end. And, but it also, there's a rotational force, it's not really showing here, that is very damaging because that's what actually breaks up the capillaries in your brain, and it can actually destroy the neurons as well. Next. Okay, so concussion comes from the Latin word. It's concussus, which is to shake violently. And so it really causes the brain, there's fluid that surrounds the brain, but with enough force, then it actually slams up against the skull. And that's what really causes the injury to the brain. Next. And so these are some of the symptoms. I'm not going to read through all of them. I think most of you might be familiar with some of these symptoms. Okay. And for those who have gone, deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, our wounded warriors, this is really something that is most, I think, important to them. Okay, next. What happens when the soldiers encounter like an IED, the explosive device, that the explosion creates this pressure wave that actually moves very rapidly through the brain at very high speeds. And then there's also this complex pressure wave that occurs because, the brain is not just not solid matter, but, it transmits all these forces. There's sound waves and there's pressure waves, okay? And as far as the statistics, there's over 344,000 military troops that were deployed that got diagnosed with TBI between 2000 and 2015, and close to 70% were actually screened, positive for TBI from explosions, and so it really is a serious problem. We ramp down, and so next slide, please. You could see that there's a bit of a ramp down in the number of soldiers who came back diagnosed, but I think now we're starting to ramp back up again, and so it really is an ongoing issue. Next. And so what happens exactly within the brain during an injury? This is a PET scan, and FDG is fluorodeoxyglucose, which is what they inject into the body. They do this for cancer patients, but they also do it for those with severe traumatic brain injury. And what you see on this side of the screen, on the left side, that's what a normal brain looks like. So this is looking at the glucose metabolism in the brain, because the brain, even though it's kind of a relatively small part of our body, actually consumes about 20% of the energy, of the ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the energy currency in the body. And you could see it all light up. That's what it should look like. But when there's brain damage, you see how dark it is on the right side of the brain. And so really, in helping anyone who has TBI, the first step really ought to be you really want to try to minimize activity to rest, because if you have these areas of glucose impairment and you're trying to do things still, that's creating activity, that's going to lead to long-term inflammation, because what happens after the initial injury is that this occurs, and then 24 hours after that, there's just rapid inflammation that takes place. It's part of the body's healing process, but because it's just so widespread that the inflammation becomes problematic. And so that's the second part of what needs to be addressed. Okay, next. And so I mentioned, this, and this is how we think. This is a neuron. This is actually the cell body, and then that long, extension there is called the axon, and around the axon is what's called myelin. And in people who have Alzheimer's or ALS and Parkinson's, it's that myelin sheath that somehow becomes it deteriorates. And so you just have, just the nerves that's exposed, and that's what creates a lot of issues. And so, and then there's tiny capillaries that aren't showing here, but that can actually be destroyed from a traumatic brain injury as well. And so information travels. It's like electrical signals that travel through this, and it goes across that synapse right there, that little gap of space. That's actually a projection of one of the little ends there. Okay, next. And so Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And so I just love that, because I really believe that when we have this approach that using food as medicine, you don't see a lot of the side effects that you would see if you're taking pharmaceutical drugs, which always have a side effect. Okay, next. And so how do you deal with the glucose impairment from a brain injury? They've done a lot of research on the ketogenic diet, and for those who are not familiar with this diet, it's one where actually 80 to 90% of your calories will come from fat. And I know that seems like a large amount, but if you think about it, you really want to try to maintain the energy metabolism in your brain where there's injury. And when it can't, that's when tissue begins to die. And what happens when you have a diet that is ketogenic, meaning that it's going to create ketones, then, and see, those are some of the conditions that it covers. Next slide. Ketones, to explain it to you what it is, it's actually something that the body actually creates. It's done in the liver. And back in the caveman days, when they couldn't always get food, our body is designed to burn glucose. That's the preferred fuel. But there were times when the caveman couldn't maybe catch his prey or get food. There were times of famine. And so the body is so adaptive, the way how God designed it, is that when there's no glucose to burn, it will switch to fat burning, which is what creates these ketones. And it's produced in the liver during times when your calories have been reduced. Next. And that's called caloric restriction. And so there's actually over 70 years of research in this area, and they have found that when you reduce your caloric intake, that by 25 and even up to 60%, that it actually improves longevity. It actually resets a lot of the inflammatory markers that have been set off by injury. And so that's actually the approach that I took with cancer. I went on a caloric restricted diet. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to starve. It means that you cut back significantly on carbohydrates, and you really ramp up on nutritionally dense foods. And for me, I adapted into an organic raw vegan diet, because raw vegetables actually have a lot of enzymes which our bodies need for every function in our body. And when you cook foods, you actually destroy the enzymes, and we're living bodies, and we need this life force that comes from the plants. Okay, next. And so they've done a lot of studies. They've looked at this caloric restriction on rhesus monkeys, and it's just really amazing, because it shows that even the animals that had cancer, it shows a regression in cancer, and it shows improved longevity. Next. And so here's another chart that just shows how it actually improves how long one can live, just when you restrict your calories by 40% than the standard diet. Okay, next. And so what's interesting, when you apply this to traumatic brain injury, often TBI patients have seizures, and you could see on the far right that when the diet allows for this ketone to be produced, and you can even supplement with ketone esters, that there's a 575% reduction in seizures. And I think that's just really amazing when you think about that. Okay, next. And so these are some of the biomarkers, and so you can really actually monitor what goes on when you're caloric restricted. And the goal here is to significantly reduce blood glucose, because if you're eating carbohydrates and things like that, that's going to drive your glucose up, and you can't get into creating ketone bodies within your body, which is what you want to burn as the alternative fuel. Next. And so what does this look like? So this is looking at the standard diet versus ketogenic diet, and you can see when you break it down by carbohydrate, fat, protein, energy, and then this is the fat to protein and carbohydrate ratio, what it looks like. So it's very different. You know, the standard diet, you're going to have 62% of your what you intake as carbs, but you're bringing it down to 3. And so everything is, you're kind of flipping it around in a way, but and it's not very easy. It's something that you need to really kind of work with somebody on and to monitor. They sell these little sticks that you can monitor your ketones, you can monitor your glucose level, so you could see if you're actually inducing ketosis within your body. Next. And the ketogenic diet, you really want to be able to ideally maintain a 4-to-1 ratio of fats to protein and carbohydrates. That is very, very challenging to do. And so if you can get to even a 2-to-1 ratio, you're doing well. Okay, next. And so I'm going to go now into the specifics of what are some of the foods you can add, you know, supplements and foods. And so oils, fatty acids are very important. Next. And this is also known more commonly as EPA and DHA. These are basically omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they're very important to the cell membrane throughout your body. It affects how fluid things move within your body, as well as the thickness, cell signaling. You know, that's important in just how we think and how all our bodily functions perform, as well as mitochondria function, which means it's the energy production, you know, whether or not we have enough energy to even do our day-to-day tasks. And so DHA is the predominant fatty acid that is in the brain, and you know, it can be found in foods like certain nuts, oils, and also cold water fish. Next. I mentioned the down-term effects of having glucose impairment of the brain is you get inflammation, and so this item, I don't know, how many of you are familiar with turmeric? Oh, great, most of you are. That's awesome. So it's part of the ginger family. Next slide. And it's a powerful anti-inflammatory and an antioxidant as well, and it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it can help to improve on some of the inflammation that someone might be experiencing. It also helps to reduce cellular edema, which is that fluid retention, like what I was experiencing in my body. But with a brain injury, you can imagine how painful it is for someone to deal with brain swelling because the skull was not able to expand. And then there's a lot of oxidation that occurs with the injury too, and so turmeric can really help to combat some of that. Next. Resveratrol, this is an item that's a compound that's actually found in the skin of grapes. It also crosses the blood-brain barrier and helps to actually reduce the loss of neurons in your brain. It also helps to combat oxidative stress, and I mentioned the lipid peroxidation, which is what occurs with a cellular damage. You know, you can think of oxidation basically like when you cut an apple open and it turns brown, that's due to oxidation. It's a similar process that occurs in your body when there's oxidative damage. Our bodies normally, it's a normal part of our metabolism to have oxidative damage, and so that's not unusual, but extra damage occurs, unfortunately, when there's injuries like this. Okay, next. Creatine is, you like?
I'm a health coach too, so everything you're saying, she's 100% right.
Oh, great, thank you. That's great. Yeah, so amino acids, and it's a lot of people know about it for muscle building and athletes, but it's very important. It's found in protein-rich foods because that's what actually will help generate the adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency in the body. And that's, so that's very important because after a traumatic brain injury, this level usually drops off. And so, you know, that's why, you know, people need to rest a lot, but this will really help in that area. Next. Green tea, next. Green tea has something called EGCG. It's a flavonoid that also crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it's neuroprotective. It's protective of your entire body, in fact. It's also a very potent antioxidant. It fights against cancer. And there's something called theanine also, which protects you from excitotoxic injury. So what happened in a brain injury is that when there's damage to the mitochondria, that it actually releases, you know, it dumps all this glutamate out into the brain. And when that happens, you know, that just creates significant injuries. And so you need to, it actually disrupts the calcium ions. And so there's this ionic flow, which basically determines, you know, just how well you can think, because it all affects the membrane potential, which is basically how energy, you know, how the electric energy flows. There has to be a voltage potential difference. And so this green tea can actually help protect from this damage. Next. And vitamins E and C, I think most of you are probably very familiar with this. They're powerful antioxidants, and vitamin C in particular is very powerful. It's one of the most powerful antioxidants in the body. Okay, next. Vitamin D as well. You know, there's still a lot of studies that are ongoing, so it hasn't been that conclusive, but it is neuroprotective. It's one of these fat-soluble vitamins, and it's actually found very low in most people, you know, living where we live. You know, the best way to get vitamin D is really to be outside in the sun, and when the photonic energy from the sun hits your skin, then, you know, electrons are actually, you know, start to flow underneath your skin, which basically start the whole process for vitamin D. And so you can supplement with vitamin D. It's probably the second best thing to do, but know that when you're supplementing with vitamin D, you're actually getting the chemical signature of vitamin D without actually getting the energy from the sun. And so you're actually decoupling the feedback mechanism that's in your body. So my best advice to people is always to just spend like a lot of time out in the sun. And what's interesting is that they've done studies with progesterone combined with vitamin D. Progesterone is a hormone, and it actually helps to significantly reduce mortality following a TBI, which I find very interesting. Okay.